Imagine waking up yesterday, April 2, 2026, and seeing literally every energy headline screaming the exact same thing.
Oh yeah, it was completely unavoidable.
Right. Like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just granted California's last nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon, a 20-year federal license renewal.
Which is a massive deal. I mean, on paper.
Exactly. And almost instantly, you saw the global commodity markets completely explode. They
Hmm.
basically priced in up to 22 million pounds of new locked-in uranium demand.
Right, because the algorithms and the traders just saw a 20-year extension and ran with it.
Yeah, but there is just one massive structural problem with that calculation. California state law currently dictates that running that exact power plant past 2030 is completely 100% illegal.
Yeah, the dislocation we're seeing right now between the trading response and the actual statutory reality on the ground in Sacramento is, well, it's staggering.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive today is looking at a daily content brief we got from Uranium Unleashed. It's dated April 3, 2026. And we really want to explore why this massive celebration across the uranium investment community is based on a profound misunderstanding.
We're looking at a textbook case of jurisdiction blindness here. Billions of dollars in capital reacting to a flattened top-level headline and entirely ignoring the subterranean regulatory mechanics that actually determine if a plant gets to operate.
Right. And before we get too deep into the weeds, I do want to make a quick note for you listening. We are going to be touching on state politics and environmental legal battles today, but strictly to analyze the facts from the source material.
Yeah, we're not taking any political sides here.
Exactly. No sides. We're solely focused on dissecting the information provided in the brief. Okay, let's unpack this, because to see why the market got this so wrong, we really have to look at the exact legal wording of what the NRC handed Pacific Gas and Electric yesterday regarding Diablo Canyon Units 1 and 2.
So the NRC extended the operational authority of Unit 1, which provides about 11,122 megawatts of baseload power. They extended that out to November 2044.
Okay, so that's Unit 1.
Right. And then Unit 2, which provides another 11,118 megawatts, that was extended to August 2045.
Got it. So when you aggregate that, you're looking at roughly 2,240 megawatts of continuous, uninterruptible generation.
Yeah, which is massive. In the context of the California Independent System Operator CAISO, that represents about 9% of the state's total electricity supply.
9%. That's powering roughly 3.8 million homes. And from a grid physics perspective, that 2,240 megawatts is fundamentally different from a wind or solar asset of the exact same nameplate capacity, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not even comparable.
Because we're talking about baseload inertia, which California relies on heavily to manage the duck curve.
That distinction is crucial. Solar generation drops off a cliff precisely when evening demand spikes, which is the neck of the duck curve.
Right. When everyone gets home and turns on their AC and their TVs.
Exactly. And Diablo Canyon provides frequency regulation and voltage support that stabilizes the entire grid during those volatile ramp periods. The sheer systemic importance of that stabilization is really why the market reacted so violently to the NRC news yesterday.
They see the federal stamp of approval and just assume it's a done deal.
Yeah, the assumption is that because the asset is so critical, a 20-year federal safety validation basically guarantees 20 years of commercial operation.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate here. If the federal government says the plant is safe to run for 2 decades, why isn't that the end of the story? Under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, federal regulations preempt state laws, right?
In overlapping domains, yes.
So if the NRC, which is, an apex federal agency, if they do all the metallurgical testing, the seismic modeling, the reactor vessel analysis, and they say the facility is perfectly safe to operate, how does California legally avoid a federal preemption lawsuit from PG&E? If the feds say go, how can the state say stop?
And that is the exact legal trap the uranium bulls fell into yesterday. They assume the Supremacy Clause acts like a bulldozer.
Right.
But nuclear energy regulation in the U.S. operates under a deeply bifurcated jurisdictional framework. It was actually cemented by a 1983 Supreme Court case, PG&E versus State Energy Resources Conservation and Development Commission.
Okay, so this goes way back.
Yeah, and the court ruled that under the Atomic Energy Act, the federal government, meaning the NRC, has absolute exclusive authority over radiological safety.
Just safety.
It's just safety. But the states retain absolute authority over traditional utility domains. So that's economics, land use, rate making, and state-level environmental zoning.
To put it in an analogy, it's like the federal government issuing you a 20-year driver's license.
Right.
They're saying you are legally and physically capable of driving safely for 20 years.
Right. You pass the vision test, you pass the road test.
Exactly. But the state you live in says, well, your specific car is illegal to drive on our roads after 4 years because of local emission laws. The federal license doesn't force the state to let you drive an illegal car.
That's a perfect way to look at it. California isn't challenging the NRC on whether Diablo Canyon is safe. They don't have the jurisdiction to do that anyway. They are enforcing a shutdown purely on economic and state jurisdictional grounds.
So the NRC verifying that PG&E can operate the reactor without a radiological incident doesn't compel the state of California to actually buy the electricity.
Precisely. It doesn't compel them to authorize the rate recovery or grant the coastal land use permits required for the plant to even exist. The NRC only cares about compliance and safety. Sacramento handles literally everything else.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to the actual law on the books in California right now, which is Senate Bill 846. This seems to be the statutory brick wall the market is just completely ignoring.
Yeah, SB 846 was passed primarily as a short-term grid stabilization measure back when they realized they might have rolling blackouts. But it carries a very specific hard expiration date.
Which is what?
It legally authorizes Diablo Canyon's operations strictly until 2030. Period.
So 4 more years.
Right. It provides the mechanism for a loan to keep the plant afloat, and it directs state agencies to facilitate operation, but that statutory authority dissolves entirely at the end of the decade.
So operating past 2030 would require what exactly?
It requires an entirely new piece of legislation to pass both the California State Assembly and the Senate, and then secure the governor's signature. And as of our conversation today, no such bill has even been introduced.
Let's dig into the mechanics of why PG&E can't just, ignore the state and run the plant anyway, like rely on wholesale market revenues or something.
Because California utilities are fully regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC. They don't operate in a free market. They operate under what's called a general rate case framework. Every single dollar they spend on capital improvements, maintenance, and notably nuclear fuel procurement must go through a CPUC prudency review.
A prudency review?
Yeah. So if PG&E spends money on a 20-year operational horizon like signing fuel contracts out to 2045, but the CPUC determines that spending is quote-unquote imprudent because state law mandates a 2030 shutdown.
The CPUC will just deny the rate recovery.
Exactly. That means PG&E's shareholders would have to absorb the entire cost, and no utility executive in the country is going to greenlight billions of dollars in stranded capital risk.
Yeah, that would be career suicide. So to really understand this, let's take a step further into the commodity markets and look at the actual mathematical error in how this uranium demand is being priced right now.
Let's do it.
We know Diablo Canyon's 2 pressurized water reactors consume a midpoint estimate of, 420 tons of U3O8 per year, assuming a standard 90% capacity factor.
Right. And converting those 420 tons into the standard market metric, we are looking at roughly 900,000 to 1 million pounds of U3O8 consumed annually by this single facility.
1 million pounds a year. Okay, so if we project the demand under the actual reality of current California law, we'll call this scenario A, operating from 2026 to the 2030 cap, we only have a 4-year run rate.
Yeah, 4 years, which represents approximately 4 million pounds of total uranium demand. And to be clear, that is the only demand currently authorized to exist under the law.
Yet the forward curves and the equity reactions yesterday on Twitter and in the markets, they were all modeling scenario B.
Which is operating from 2026 all the way to the end of the newly minted NRC licenses in 2044 and 2045.
Right, a 19-year operational block. And that translates to roughly 19 million pounds of demand.
Leaving us with a 15 million pound disconnect.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because 15 million pounds of uranium demand isn't just a rounding error. I mean, that's a massive market-moving hallucination based on a law that hasn't even been written yet.
What's fascinating here is how the market is pricing in that 15 million pounds of structural demand as a contracted, ironclad reality. In a global uranium market that is already operating under severe structural deficits, dropping 15 million pounds of assumed demand onto the scales acts as a massive price floor mechanism.
It inflates everything.
Exactly. It's confusing, legally possible under federal law, with guaranteed to happen.
I have to challenge the premise that the market is entirely foolish here, though. I mean, markets are fundamentally forward-looking discount mechanisms. Aren't investors just pricing in the high probability that the California legislature will eventually capitulate?
Wow.
Because, the duck curve isn't going anywhere, baseload power is increasingly scarce, and AI data center load growth is just accelerating everywhere.
Hmm.
Maybe they're betting that grid physics will ultimately force Sacramento to change the law to match the federal license.
Sure, pricing improbability is one thing, but pricing uncertainty is another entirely. The error here is the complete lack of a risk discount applied to that 15 million pounds. The market assumes zero political friction.
They just assume the state will fold.
Right. They assume that because the federal government removed the safety regulatory barrier, the state legislative barrier will just magically fall by default. And that is a fundamental mispricing of California energy politics. Not to mention, it completely ignores the immense friction of the fuel procurement cycle itself.
Oh, right, because PG&E does not have the luxury of waiting for Sacramento to capitulate.
Exactly.
Let's transition to that procurement cycle, because this is where PG&E faces just an agonizing corporate paradox. It's the 2026 time bomb. They can't just log on to a Bloomberg terminal in 2029 and buy U308 on the spot market to drop into the reactor core the next day.
No, not at all. The physical realities of the nuclear fuel cycle require decisions today for power that's going to be generated years in the future. The lead times are unforgiving.
How unforgiving are we talking?
At a minimum, utilities require 18 to 36 months of runway. You acquire the raw U308, the yellow cake, but that is literally just the starting line.
Right, because it's not reactor ready.
Far from it. It then has to be shipped to a conversion facility to be processed into uranium hexafluoride, UF6.
Which takes time.
Then it moves to an enrichment facility where it's measured in separative work units, or SWUs, to increase the concentration of the U-235 isotope. And finally, it goes to a fuel fabrication facility to be manufactured into the precise physical assemblies required for a specific reactor design.
And we are currently seeing massive bottlenecks at the enrichment phase.
Right.
Particularly given the geopolitical efforts to decouple Western utilities from Russian enrichment capacity.
No, massive bottlenecks. Those SW constraints mean Western utilities are competing fiercely for very limited Western enrichment slots. You simply cannot secure those slots on a month-to-month basis.
So utilities have to secure that supply chain through long-term contracts.
Typically 5 to 10 years out, yeah. That guarantees availability and hedges against spot market volatility. Currently, the spot market for U308 is sitting around $65 to $70 a pound, and conversion costs are highly elevated at around $40 a kilogram.
So buying short-term means getting totally gouged.
Exactly. It exposes the ratepayer to exorbitant premiums.
It feels akin to trying to cater a massive 20-day wedding, right?
Okay, I like this.
But the venue is only legally booked for 4 days. And the food takes 3 days just to prepare. So if you buy food for 4 days, you pay these exorbitant last-minute small batch prices. But if you buy enough for 20 days to get the bulk discount and the venue kicks you out on day 5, you face financial ruin because you have all this food you can't use.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the exact definition of procurement limbo. PG&E's internal filings explicitly state the decision really needs to happen in 2026 because of our lead time for fuel purchasing.
Wow, they literally called out 2026.
Yes. If PG&E acts conservatively and models a 2030 shutdown to match state law, they must rely on short-term contracts and spot purchases, and that results in massive price gouging that the CPUC will scrutinize.
And potentially reject.
Right. But if they take the risk and purchase long-term contracts modeled on a 2045 horizon to achieve economies of scale, and then the legislature refuses to extend SB 846, PG&E is holding millions of dollars in completely unusable fuel contracts.
And every single one of those fuel contracts has to be publicly filed and debated in a CPUC prudency review, which takes months to do. They basically have to publicly state their assumptions about a highly volatile political future.
And either decision triggers immense political blowback.
Which brings us to the political wall and the active resistance.
Okay.
Because if PG&E decides to take the risk and push for a 20-year contract, they aren't just fighting the clock. They are fighting active, organized opposition right now.
The opposition isn't waiting for the 2030 legislative battle to start. They are attacking the state-level permits immediately.
This was honestly the most striking tactical detail we reviewed in the brief. Literally 1 day before the NRC announced the 20-year federal extension on April 1st, 2026, a coalition of anti-nuclear organizations led by Mothers for Peace filed legal interventions.
Yeah.
But they didn't target the federal NRC license. They targeted the state water discharge permits.
They know they can't fight the NRC on radiological safety, so they bypass the federal framework entirely to attack the cooling infrastructure at the state level. It's a very sophisticated delay strategy.
How does that work exactly, the cooling infrastructure?
So Diablo Canyon operates on what's called a once-through cooling system. It draws in roughly 2.5 billion gallons of ocean water per day to condense the steam exiting the turbines, and then it discharges that water back into the Pacific.
2.5 billion gallons a day. That is a massive amount of water.
It is. And the environmental regulation of that specific process falls squarely under the jurisdiction of the State Water Resources Control Board and Section 316B of the Clean Water Act.
And the regulatory attacks from these groups focus on two distinct biological impacts. The first is thermal pollution, which is discharging water back into the ocean at temperatures that could alter the local marine ecosystem.
Right.
And the second is entrainment, which is the impingement of marine life like larvae, plankton, small fish getting caught on the intake screens.
And the State Water Board actually enforces a policy requiring the phase-out of once-through cooling specifically because of those entrainment impacts.
Wait, so how has Diablo Canyon been allowed to operate this whole time if the state is phasing out once-through cooling?
Because Diablo Canyon was previously granted a compliance deferral, but that deferral was intrinsically tied to the assumption of a near-term shutdown.
Wow.
Yeah. So by intervening in the renewal of those discharge certificates right now, the opposition groups are utilizing an asymmetrical legal playbook. And frankly, it's the exact same playbook they successfully used to delay Diablo in the 2010s.
It's a weaponization of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA.
Absolutely.
Because if they can force the State Water Board to mandate the construction of closed-cycle cooling towers, which is a multi-billion-dollar retrofit, they destroy the plant's economic viability entirely.
The federal safety license becomes totally irrelevant if the state mandates an uneconomical water system.
And this legal roadblock exists completely independent of the legislative pathway. Even if PG&E manages to navigate the whole fuel procurement paradox we talked about.
Which is a huge if.
Huge if. But even if they do, and even if the California legislature miraculously passes a post-2030 extension bill, a revocation or even a strict modification of the cooling water permit forces a shutdown anyway.
Yes. Which introduces the intense political timing constraints. Governor Gavin Newsom, who, he reversed his longstanding position to support the plant's extension in 2022 to prevent grid failures.
Right.
Well, he leaves office in January 2027.
Right, in just 9 months. So how does a utility navigate an environment where the political landscape could entirely shift so quickly?
The political calendar is the ultimate unyielding metric here. Passing contentious energy legislation requires heavy executive capital. If a new bill isn't drafted, navigated through committee, passed by a historically anti-nuclear legislature, and signed while Newsom is still in office to expend that capital, the bureaucratic inertia will naturally pull the facility right over that 2030 statutory cliff.
Because a new governor, whoever it is, dealing with a fresh legislative agenda is highly unlikely to prioritize a massive, politically radioactive fight over a legacy nuclear plant.
Exactly. So the window for PG&E to secure legislative certainty and resolve the fuel procurement paradox essentially closes at the end of 2026, or early 2027 at the absolute latest.
That is a brutally narrow window.
That 2026 to 2027 window is the crucible. If legislation isn't passed while national nuclear sentiment is high and Newsom is in office, the path to 2045 effectively closes. The market pricing in 2045 as a given completely ignores the fact that the actual battle must be fought and won in the next 18 months.
Okay, so we've established the gap between federal approval and state reality, the 2026 fuel procurement trap, and the active legal opposition fighting the water permits. So how should a listener actually process this complex web of information?
We need to recalibrate reality here.
Yeah, if we throw out the 22 million pound headline assumption, what does a structurally sound, honest uranium demand model actually look like?
A sound approach abandons this binary thinking and adopts a tiered model, breaking the demand into distinct confidence tranches.
Okay, let's break down the tranches.
The first tranche is the high confidence demand. This is the roughly 4 million pounds required to operate through the existing SB 846 cap of 2030.
Right, because the legal framework for that exists.
The CPUC mechanisms are in place. The grid necessity is immediate. That volume can be considered fundamentally locked in.
Then what about the medium confidence tranche?
The medium confidence tranche encompasses the bulk of that contested 15 million pounds, representing operations from 2031 out to 2045.
And to assign value to that tranche, an analyst would have to what mapped the probability of the California legislature actually passing a new statutory authorization overriding the 2030 cap.
Exactly. You have to model the Newsom transition, assess the grid capacity additions over the next 3 years, like are they building enough battery storage to replace Diablo, and track the CPUC's appetite for authorizing long-term fuel contracts in an uncertain legal environment.
Which is incredibly complex.
Right, and any model treating the NRC news yesterday as 100% certainty is overstating the reality by roughly 4 to 1. You have to heavily discount that medium confidence demand against the political friction.
And I assume the low confidence tranche is just assuming the absolute frictionless execution of that full 2045 timeline.
Yes, it assumes perfect execution. It assumes the legislature acts quickly, the CPUC grants full rate recovery for a 20-year fuel procurement cycle, and crucially, that the anti-nuclear coalition completely fails in their CEQA and state water board interventions regarding the once-through cooling.
It assumes zero subsequent legal challenges over a 2-decade horizon.
And in California infrastructure development, assuming zero friction is essentially analytical malpractice.
It really is. Thinking about the listener's journey here, you started this deep dive looking at a massive, seemingly straightforward headline. 20 years of federal approval, boom, done.
And now you have a calibrated 3-tiered framework to evaluate the market.
The overarching takeaway from this recalibration is that the NRC's 20-year federal safety license is a necessary condition, but it is deeply insufficient on its own.
This raises an important question about how we consume information. We have to constantly evaluate regulatory announcements by asking, does this approval actually guarantee the outcome or just allow for the possibility of an outcome?
You absolutely need the NRC license to prevent an immediate forced closure. But acquiring it merely buys you a ticket to fight the state-level jurisdictional battles. It doesn't bypass them.
Exactly. It allows the conversation about the future of the plant to begin. It absolutely does not conclude it.
And understanding that distinction reveals the 15 million pound demand illusion that's currently driving the uranium spot and term markets. To quickly summarize our core takeaways today, we have the fundamental clash between the 20-year NRC license and the strict 4-year California state law.
We have a 15 million pound demand illusion that the market is mispricing.
And we have PG&E's 2026 fuel procurement paradox, squeezed by state politics on one side and anti-nuclear water permit litigation on the other.
A true multi-layered gauntlet.
And just a quick reminder, this breakdown was purely an analysis of the legal and market dynamics. We take no sides on the underlying political or environmental debates here. We're just reporting the facts from the brief. But I do want to leave you with one final, broader implication to ponder. The subtle detail from the sources, but amidst all the filings and legal interventions regarding Diablo Canyon, there was a quiet milestone reached last month in March 2026. The NRC actually issued its first commercial construction permit for a new generation TerraPower Natrium reactor.
Which is a critical transition point from legacy light water technology to advanced sodium-cooled fast reactors.
Exactly. Now, consider all the friction we just spent the last hour dissecting. We have Diablo Canyon, a traditional, fully constructed legacy asset. It has an established supply chain. It currently supplies nearly a tenth of the world's 5th largest economy, and it actually possesses the active support of the sitting governor.
For now, anyway.
Right, for now. Yet, just to maintain its existing operational status, it must run this excruciating, multi-layered gauntlet of federal-state preemption battles, biological water discharge litigation, and an agonizingly complex fuel procurement paradox tied to CPUC rate recovery mechanics. If keeping a fully operational grid-critical plant online requires navigating a 15 million pound paradox and a bureaucratic labyrinth this dense, what does this regulatory maze mean for the next generation of nuclear power trying to break ground?
It's daunting.
TerraPower and other small modular reactor developers aren't just trying to maintain operations. They are trying to site new land, establish entirely new high-assay, low-enriched uranium fuel supply chains, and build novel cooling infrastructures. If the friction to stand still is this immense, building the future of energy might require a completely new playbook.
The engineering might be ready, but the regulatory architecture is still built for the 1970s.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, always verify the jurisdiction behind the headlines, and we will catch you on the next one.